Thank you for joining us tonight for a compelling and timely conversation, Daring Peace, Sant'Egidio, Diplomacy, and a World at War, with Professor Marco Impagliazzo, President of the Community of Sant'Egidio. In a time when global conflict too often feels like the norm, Professor Impagliazzo offers us a powerful alternative, one rooted in dialogue, solidarity, and a courageous commitment to peace. President of the Community of Sant'Egidio since 2003, Marco Impagliazzo is full professor of contemporary history at the University of Roma III. He has a PhD in social and religious history. His field of scholarly expertise is the Catholic Church in the 19th and 20th centuries, and more generally, religion in Europe and in the relations between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in the Mediterranean areas in contemporary times. Very busy. Huh? Founded in Rome in 1968, the Community of Sant'Egidio is a lay Catholic movement committed to prayer, service to the poor, and peace building. Over the decades, it has become an internationally respected force in conflict mediation, working quietly but effectively to foster dialogue and reconciliation in some of the world's most difficult regions, from Mozambique to South Sudan. We are also pleased to welcome our distinguished respondent, Professor Andrea Bartoli of Columbia University, who will help us reflect more deeply on tonight's themes. Professor Bartoli is the president of the Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue, an association of the Community of Sant'Egidio. He works primarily on peacemaking, genocide prevention, and nuclear disarmament. Also very busy. Bartoli has been, I'm so sorry, but I mean, these are sad times, sometimes, Bartoli has been a member of the Community of Sant'Egidio since 1970. Thank you for joining us this evening as we explore what it truly means to their peace in a fractured world. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Buonasera. I will speak in English, but we are in an Italian house, so. Nothing is equal to peace, says St. John Chrysostom. Daring to speak of peace seems naive in a time dominated by force and multiplying wars. According to EICLEID, Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, Conflicts Index, there are currently 50 cases of, I quote, extreme, high, or turbulent levels of conflict in the world. After declining during the 90s, wars between states have begun to increase again in the new millennium. What has never declined, however, is the rate of violence linked to internal crises of terrorism, with some particularly brutal cases such as, for example, the civil war in Algeria, 1991-2002, which claimed perhaps 200,000 victims, and which I personally dealt with when the Community of Sant'Egidio attempted mediation in 1994-96 to prevent the massacre. I could also mention the wars in Democratic Republic of Congo, a series of conflicts that have been going on since 1996 and have claimed many victims. In the tormented region of Kivu, in the city of Goma, at the heart of that war, Sant'Egidio lost one of its young members who was beatified as a martyr by Pope Leo on June 15 this year. Floribert Buonacciui, a 26-year-old customs officer, refused to give in to corruption in 2007 and was tortured and killed in that climate of extreme violence. A world with so many conflicts, especially when they do not stop and become permanent, numbly changes the mentality of individuals and peoples. People become accustomed to war as a means of solving problems or as an inevitable effect of situations considered unchangeable. This habit becomes resignation in the face of crisis, rehabilitating war and making people think that peace is impossible or at least very difficult. This is what most of our Western societies think today in the face of the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. In the jargon of analysts, they are called intractable conflicts. Yet, despite this resigned and conformist habit, a demand for peace survives in the world, especially among ordinary people. It is a widespread aspiration that is nevertheless little heard and often silenced by the media or drowned out by the noise of war. On the few occasions when this dream of peace emerges, it is mostly derided or criticized as a naive and do-gooder ideal. Today, war seems to be the only language of international relations, unfortunately, even in the West. People no longer believe in the power of diplomacy, that is, of wars, negotiation, and reasonable discussion. The idea that one can reach a compromise by giving up part of one's own reasons seems impractical or, in some cases, even unfair. We are very far from the never again of 1945, far from the spirit that created the United Nations here in New York after a global and atrocious war such as World War II. The time of that Jamais plus la guerre, shouted by Paul VI at the United Nations on October 4th, 1965, when introducing himself and the Church as experts in humanity, seems to have long gone. At the end of World War II, Westerners developed an awareness that seems to have vanished today, that of considering war as an unjust instrument that produces injustice or gives rise to a peace that is never completely just. In other words, the idea had matured that war was a perverse mechanism and not an instrument of impartiality. Just before the outbreak of the world conflict, Pope Pius XII said, I quote, "Everything is lost with war. Nothing can be lost with peace." End of quote. Today, these words seem like distant echoes, lost in the noise of history, yet they represent the experience of an entire generation that went through the furnace of war and witnesses its horrors. Symbols of these horrors were the Shoah and the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Humankind had discovered itself to be violent to the point of imagining genocide or creating a weapon capable of destroying all humanity. Of course, these are different events that cannot be placed on the same level. What I want to say, however, is that they both revealed humankind's lethal capacity when carried away by the demon of war. The only way to hear the stifled cry for peace of the peoples is to stand on the side of the victims, on the side of those who die, of those who are wounded, of those who lost their loved ones, who lost their homes, their country, on the side of those who lost everything. This is the testimony of the community of Sant'Egidio, to look at the world from the point of view of the victims, of all victims, without distinction and without color, without hierarchizing them, and without creating a macabre competition between them. The absurdity of war can truly be seen by standing on the side of the victims who have no voice and always remain anonymous. We want to remember their names and their stories. Absurdly, we do not even know their number. It seems paradoxical. While there is so much talk about war and weapons, but we don't know the number of victims. In every war, the first to pay the price are the defenseless, the children, the women, the sick, the elderly, the poor, people with disabilities. We have welcomed a little children of 3 years old 2 days ago in Rome from Gaza with a strong disability, without family. Terrible. In short, the price is paid firstly by those who cannot flee. And then there is also the fact that war continues to kill long after it has ended. Let's think about landmines, refugees, suffering people fleeing aimlessly, as we have seen in the images of war in Ukraine and we see in Gaza. Ciao, grazie Paolo. Posso bere da qui? Grazie. Siamo in università. Grazie. In Ukraine, there are no official figures, only estimates. According to the information available, Ukrainian military casualties number around 60,000, but the Pentagon speaks of more than 80,000 and 400,000 wounded and maimed. Russians' losses are estimated at 1 million, data to be verified. In Gaza, we have the number of victims of the atrocious pogrom of October 7th, 1,200 people dead, plus over 250 hostages. We also have almost all the faces, an immense tragedy that did not even spare newborns. On the other hand, we know almost nothing about the Palestinian victims. According to local sources, there are over 64,000, but these are also estimates. Who has gone to count those left under the rubble of the buildings? There are also those who have died of starvation. The terrible fact is that almost all of them are civilians. I would also like to mention the victims in Africa. They are at least 100,000 in Sudan in the civil war that began in April last year. But there are over 2.5 million refugees with nothing. Since 2013, a civil war has been raging in South Sudan, which is proceeding in fits and starts and is believed to have caused almost 400,000 100,000 deaths. There are the victims of Kivu that I mentioned earlier. Here the toll is staggering, with an estimated 5 million victims since 1996. The war in Syria, which ended last year, is said to have claimed 500,000 lives, including more than 160,000 civilians and more than 25,000 children and adolescents. And then there are the wars in Libya, Yemen, Iraq, northern Mozambique, Ethiopia. I wanted to give these figures to make clear the true toll of each war. If indeed we want to talk about peace, we must face war and its consequences head on. Those who work for peace must start from here and not from abstract geopolitical, legal, or political reasoning. We are talking about the life and death of real people, countless people, an immense universe of stolen years, as a Roman Jewish woman who survived Auschwitz would say. Sant'Egidio's choice for peace is, therefore, that of the victims and not of the victimizers. Only in this way can we discover the absurdity and shame of war, to use the word of Pope Francis, a shameful defeat. Ultimately, for Christians, war is an impossible terrain because it is always fratricidal, a kind of civil war, the true enemy of life, an evil to be ended as soon as possible and at any cost. For Pope Francis, every war was sacrilegious because it was contrary to the sanctity of human life. Pope Leo began his pontificate by speaking of, I quote, an armed and disarming peace. War is the true enemy of humanity because it represents the madness of evil that must be stopped as soon as possible. The longer the conflict lasts, the more it encourages an endless cycle of revenge. Encourage an endless cycle of revenge. That is why victims must be listened to without falling into victimhood, the disease of our century, avoiding the macabre competition between those who have suffered the most, those who have had the most deaths, and so on. This is the only way to remain human and understand the horror of war. For our community, making peace is not just talk, but a continuous commitment, a laborious task, a permanent concern. We now have a vast experience of lives crushed, countries destroyed that no longer exist, states that will never be reborn, broken forever. This is the bitter fruit of a mechanism that escapes those who set in motion and often cannot be stopped. As I said, these are the never-ending wars, wars that go on forever. Perhaps the most widely told story is that of the peace in Mozambique in 1992, which revealed the power of peace that Christians have in their hands. Peace can be made with bare hands by resisting evil. 2 years of complex negotiations made it clear to us that peace is built little by little. It is not achieved with a magic wand. It is not announced with catchy phrases. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why peace seems so distant today for the current mentality is one of immediate announcements and the present moment in which everything is resolved as if by magic. With Mozambique, we understood that it was necessary to tune in to the reasons of those who were fighting, but at the same time, it was essential to point out a way out, convincing those who were fighting that peace was still a possibility. In fact, when you are at war, you are totally absorbed by its logic and no longer believe in the possibility of peace. Converting the military, the men in arms, from warrior to politicians is the path to take. This is not ironic pacifism. Conflict may exist forever, but it must be brought back within the non-violent rules of politics. This is true conversion. We can testify that war marks the decline of peoples. This is the painful experience of Europe, but also of Africa and the Middle East. After a war, a man, a woman, an entire people, a state, a continent, are no longer what they were before. We have seen this in the Balkans and in Africa, and we see it today in the Middle East and elsewhere. War leaves deep wounds in the spirit of peoples. It deteriorates the soul of nations, even that of those who win. It tears apart the spirit of societies and strips them of what characterized their humanity, namely the will to hope or the desire for the future. This is why at Sant'Egidio we say that, I quote, war is the mother of all poverty, and that everything possible must be done to stop it as soon as possible. The consequences of war have made us aware of how much better it is to risk peace, even if the road is long and difficult, and even if we always have to give something up. War destroys the future, and war does, even if it is declared holy, humanitarian, or just. It destroys the earth and nature. Think of the scorched earth of Donbass, the rubble of Gaza. Who will give the inhabitants back their former country? So, what does it mean to believe in peace? We know that conflicts are often incomprehensible, intricate, difficult to understand, and controversial. This can be discouraging and lead ordinary citizens to feel a sense of helplessness that sometimes causes depression. We also know that war breeds fear and produces the tyranny of negative emotions. Everyone always thinks the worst. When faced with fear, we react instinctively and without reflection, as is happening today. Many leaders also allow themselves to be overwhelmed by fear. Instead of being reassuring, they become alarmist. It is the same mechanism we see with regards to migration. If the dominant mentality is the resigned idea that war will always be the sad companion of the life of nations, no leader will commit to peace, and no people will put pressure on their leaders to end it. Risking peace is not just a position of testimony to the value of peace, moral or religious. Petitions and demonstrations, however useful, are not enough. We need to act and intervene in a concrete way to seek peace in situations of conflict. Rather than pacifists, we should speak of peacemakers, as Sant'Egidio defines itself, that is, artisans of peace. Peace is not a state or a condition, passive or static, but a work in progress, as St. John Paul II said. We know that war is easier to explain than peace. It stirs up passions and emotions, while peace seems evanescent and fragile. War seems as old as humanity, while peace seems like an unreal invention. War seems more authentic, but it is often based on falsehoods and propaganda that are eventually revealed. It is surrounded by many lies and, above all, a victim mentality or double standards. Those who drag their people into war always play the part of victim. It is always the fault of others, of the situation, of circumstances. They say, it is others who are forcing me. Others are a danger and will attack us, or I must respond to the call of history. All this can and must be exposed. We must return to believing that politics offers solutions that war cannot provide. We must remember that war begins long before weapons are used, when contempt and prejudice become a language of hate and propaganda that becomes culture. Then it becomes politics and paves the way for conflict. The UNESCO Constitution of 1945, which predates the United Nations Charter itself, states, I quote, Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. Mutual misunderstanding between peoples has always been, throughout history, the source of suspicion and mistrust between nations, and their disagreements have too often led to war. End of quote. As Maria Montessori said, the culture of competitiveness is the beginning of every war. Peoples have a spiritual architecture that can become diseased. Being peacemakers means, first and foremost, resisting the hysterical reasoning and doctrine of hatred, making peace a vocation at the international level and at the level of society. Social cohesion, healing the torn fabric where it is most fragile, friendship between generations, dialogue between cultures and religions, and much more. Everything that defines a democratic society helps the actions of peace. We must not stop insisting on the need to live together, so that strangers can look at each other and they rediscover themselves as brothers and sisters. There is a big difference between homogenizing globalization and a community of destiny. This is supported by humanist and secular thought. I'm thinking of Ralph Dahrendorf or Manuel Castells, and by the reflections on peace in the theology of the popes of the 20th century. At the height of the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant wrote, I quote, "War eliminates fewer evils than it creates." More recently, the philosopher Hannah Arendt was even clearer. War does not restore rights, but redefines powers. Perhaps the most urgent thing today is to understand that the narrative of war is the enemy of democracy. War propaganda feeds on the culture of the enemy, demands quick solutions, and imposes decisive and irrevocable path. The culture of war feeds on nationalism and ethno-nationalism, which is the most serious disease of all, the one that destroyed democracies in Europe and caused world wars. Peacemaking is not for the naive. It means respectfully delving into the history of a man, a group, a nation, a people, delving into their consciousness to preserve the ideal of democratic coexistence. It means listening to everyone's reasons, even if you don't like them, and trying to understand the complexity of a situation. Let me be clear. Listening with respect does not mean agreeing. Understanding complexity does not mean surrendering to the other. Peacemaking is not synonymous with surrender. Rather, it manifests the effort to seek concrete ways, political, diplomatic, and cultural, for nations to live together without hating each other while remaining different. Today, there is too much hatred around us. We are poisoned by the hatred we breathe in the air. We need to strike deeper chords if we are to return to a culture of peace. Negotiating requires a lot of patience and a lot of political creativity. It is not necessary to agree on everything. We can also live in an harmonious discord, as the wisdom of the Christian East tells us. Peacemaking is not for idealists. In truth, the real idealists are those who think they can solve all problems with force and wars that they then cannot manage or stop, which have not outlet and unsolved nothing. Peacemakers are the true realists. They know that only politics can achieve what war cannot. They know how to be creative and practical at the same time. Dialogue requires experience, political acumen, knowledge of processes, diplomacy, abandoning any egocentric view and learning the art of dialogue. This is difficult for Westerners who always believe themselves to be the center of the world and a model for everyone. It is not a question of losing one's identity or values, or denying oneself, or renouncing one's convictions, or of surrendering to someone else. It is a question of regaining a sense of a community of destiny with other continents and other powers. We have already experimented with the regime change and the export of our model with disastrous results. History teaches us that war does not stop wars or repair injustice. On the contrary, every war produces a desire for revenge and thus paves the way for new wars. Only peace can produce peace and stop conflicts. Even before considering it immoral, unjust, illegitimate, or destructive, we can observe that for over 30 years, war has become useless. You don't need to be a geopolitical expert to understand this. Who among us does not know that wars of recent decades have not resolved the crisis for which they were started, desired, or decided? Not only that, but they have often made them worse. I'm going to the conclusion. What can we do then? We must commit ourselves to preventing the deep architecture of peoples from becoming infected with nationalism and hatred, the terminal illnesses of nations. We must commit ourselves to ensuring that our societies do not become diseased. In this sense, the example of Western humanism is revolutionary and can change history. We do not give enough credit to friendship between peoples as an instrument of peace, a great example for the world. Just as Europeans do not value enough their union, I speak now as European, which is not a juxtaposed sum of what they already are. It is something more. Our chaotic and warlike world needs the moral strength of Christian humanists and believers who are committed to peace and coexistence. There is strength and authority in the act of peacemaking, helping a people to emerge from war without a political or economic agenda, or for material interest or ethnic religious commonality, doing so in a selfless manner. In our contemporary world, where everything is bought and sold in the face of scenarios of epochal change, we need a force of sympathy and passion for humanity that can be a messenger of hope. This can only come from committed Christians and secular humanists who don't give in to oblivion and hatred. Hatred often creeps into wars where mutual sympathy and the spirit of living together have not been cultivated. This is our challenge. Sympathy and friendship change the stony gazes of estrangement and suspicion and encourage us to work together. 20 years ago, St. John Paul II died. He had inaugurated his pontificate with memorable words. Do not be afraid. Open, indeed, open wide the doors to Christ, to his saving power. And then he continued, this is what we want to emphasize today, open the borders of states, economic and political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, and development. Do not be afraid. Here we are. Perhaps we are still afraid. We open the borders of states, but then we go scared and close them again. We try to open up economic systems without changing them too much. And today we are terrified by the trade war. We still have to respond to those words from so many years ago. They still resonate before us, challenging us. They knock on the door of our consciousness. The real question is not which side to take when there is a war, but to build now, in the midst of the war, the world of tomorrow. This is what all those who dreamed of peace did. In the deepest darkness, they dreamed of tomorrow. Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer died 80 years ago in Flossenburg. In the darkness of his cell, he wrote, I quote, Optimism has gone out of fashion among the wise, but it is a vital energy, a force of hope when others have resigned themselves. Optimism never leaves the future to its opponents, but claims it for itself. End of quote. This is what we must do. Claim the future for ourselves and for everyone. What does this mean? It means restoring a popular basis for dialogue, restoring the reputation of peace and coexistence, precisely today when they are derided and undermined by everything and everyone. In the midst of armed wars, in the midst of trade wars, hatred, suspicion, and mistrust, we can go against the tide, reinvigorating the discourse of a common destiny. To do this, we must bring to life a true popular movement for peace, open to all. I conclude with the words of a great Italian, Davide Maria Turoldo, a priest and theologian, a monk, but also a poet who lived in the 20th century. He wrote, You who believe, you who hope, run through all the streets and squares to reveal the great secret. Go and tell the four winds that the night is passing, that everything has meaning, that wars end, that history has an outcome, that love will ultimately triumph over oblivion, and life will defeat death. Continue to say that hope has not boundaries. Thank you.
Lovely to be here, very, very full room, and delightful really to be together. We all apologize to Marco, who is now at 1:15 a.m. His body is still there, and he just arrived a couple of hours ago, so we are delighted that he was able to deliver the things and do this. It's really beautiful to be here. I'm very thankful to the house Zerilli-Marimò. This is a fantastic occasion, even for the Community of Sant'Egidio in New York. It's a lovely occasion. I think this is the first time that we have such an encounter. So thank you. Thank you all. A couple of words, maybe four, to comment on Marco's talk. The first one is taking the clue from Turoldo. You know, this idea that hope has no boundaries. Just itself, right? Not having boundaries. We live in a world in which everything is bound, is kept, is divided. And instead, I like that Professor Impagliazzo said, Turoldo is reminding us of a way in which we need to think, that hope has no boundaries. And the wind doesn't have boundaries. The spirit doesn't have boundaries. The boundaries are ours and are dividing everyone, dividing us inside first. And to recognize that hope has no boundaries means to also recognize that there is no peace without hope, but also that peace gives hope. And that we are all recognizing how tight the authoritarian world is giving us the present time, but also this responsibility of believing with Turoldo that hope has no boundaries. There is a personal responsibility of saying, yes, this is true, this is what I believe, this is what I think is right. And in this sense, we open ourselves to the second word that I would like to stress of Professor Impagliazzo, that is time. When we hear him speak from a long, ancient time, this church that has more than 2,000 years, and a very brief time, a slow time and a very quick time. The slow time of those who do have hope, those who are able to go beyond the boundaries, but also the quick time of those who are trying to save somebody, because the victims are here, the people dying are here. Those who are in need are here, are now. You cannot wait for somebody else. You cannot wait for another time. And so we understand that peace is giving, on one side, a sense of eternity, of what is coming, of what is given to us. But on the other side, is giving us the pressure, the urgency of acting in this time that is dominated by violence and oppression. And I think that what Sant'Egidio does, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the way Sant'Egidio works in diplomacy, is that most of the work is done confidentially in the house of Sant'Egidio, in the convent of Sant'Egidio, where people speak confidentially. We can even say that, I don't know, maybe 90% of whatever Sant'Egidio does never comes out in public, right? But it's this giving time to those who need to think differently. There is a way in which we give each other time when we are able to be with somebody long enough. And I think that was wonderful to hear Professor Impagliazzo explaining how Sant'Egidio is not necessarily a pacifist organization, but rather a peacemaking one, because peace emerges when somebody pays attention to the reason of those who are doing war, can do war, are committed to war. And in the friendship of those who are welcoming, the resistance of understanding emerges. Resistance is not just being contrary or actually to be hostile, enemies of somebody. The true resistance is spending time to understand, giving time to the others to explain, understanding together what could be that is not yet, exploring ways that are not possible in the violence, in the war, in the moment in which things are. So Sant'Egidio is committed to this peacemaking that is giving peace a chance, that is giving peace the possibility of being expressed through the politics of articulating together what is necessary. So the third word that I would like to stress of Professor Impagliazzo's presentation is victims. You heard it many, many, many times. Sant'Egidio starts from the victims. And those who believe in war could care less about the victims. In a logical war, the victims are actually losers. In a world in which you have the lions and the prey, the victims are just the prey. The ones that do not need to count because it's their fault. If they were really mensch, they would defend themselves. But this is a logical war. This is the absurdity of the logical war that tells us that this is who we are. And it's not true. We are all actually eagerly winning when there are no victims. When anyone who is forced in the domination of the world to suffering is welcome, accompanied, made whole in the encounter of others. The last one is on resistance. I must admit that being an Italian that became American, I have a very interesting resonance on resistance. For those who are not Italian, it doesn't sound the same, but la resistenza in Italian has a very, very vivid sound and meaning. And it's difficult not to hear this word resistance during this time, during this period, during these days. And I really feel that this resistance is nourished by ancient word. I was actually touched by how many popes you quoted in your speech. I counted them, Pius XII, Paul VI, Francis, John Paul II, Leon. And to me, it just tells a familiarity, right? A sense that this is a shared history. This is, when you were mentioning John Paul II, this is a person that you met many times, somebody that really motivated in many ways. And I think that captures well the role that Sant'Egidio needs to play in motivating many, motivating countries, in motivating multitudes in this effort to do peace. And conclude, I started with Turoldo, that was your conclusion. And just a little notation, Jesus speaks about blessed are the peacemakers, and not many know that the Greek for that peacemaking is not tekne, it's not the doing that builds something, technical or doing, building things. But poie is the roots of poetry, is the roots of creating, is the roots of imagining something that war destroys. This is where Sant'Egidio is, this is where Professor Impagliazzo is, and I'm delighted that we are all here tonight. Possiamo parlare italiano, sono contento di tradurre, o inglese. As you wish, anyone has comments, questions, we are happy to engage. Smile, lots of smiles. Very good.
I was very, very touched by your words and the thought of boundless or the disappearance of boundaries is very, very important. In 2004, when we had the tsunami, Mother Nature, Gaia, hit nations in Asia, into India and Africa. Mother Nature didn't say there were boundaries. Mother Nature hit wherever it was, and the world responded to help. 275,000 people perished in, I think it was 48 hours. My fear is that during the Second World War, Stalin said not to target specific people, but to wipe out entire villages or what have you. Because we don't want martyrs, we don't want heroes, we want to impersonalize it and make it statistical. So if it's statistics, people will not be sensitive to that. What we're doing today, I mean, again, this Charlie Kirk, this young man that was killed, he's a martyr, of course, for specific groups, and he's a hero for specific groups. I personally think that things are going to get worse in our country because no one is really standing up. Like, we need someone like you to come and actually say something. I mean, had you been at the United Nations, I mean, this country is in such crisis now, and we don't have a voice. There's no one here for us at this point. And I went to a talk in Washington, D.C., and I was invited to one of the publications, and I told them, I am fearful, this is before the election, I am fearful that everyone is talking about a cold civil war, and it's going to be a hot civil war, because no one is coming up and saying anything. And then January 6th happened. And then they pardoned all these people. So I see such a reminiscence of what's going to happen with the Second World War, with Rome, and the black shirts and the brown shirts. I see it all happening now. And I passed by Federal Plaza, and a couple of times they said, you're going to be arrested. And I'm screaming at them, love thy neighbor. Love thy neighbor. And you see these people huddled and crying there. But I'm the only one. Where are the people? We don't have anyone. I hate to just make a statement like that, but we really need someone like you to come and make a statement, you know? Forgive me for taking up your time.
Hello, good evening. This is probably between a question and a non-question. I don't know. How do we stop this, what's happening in the last 20 years, that coincidentally seems to be the same time frame in which you say wars, civil wars, and conflict have been going up in levitation again, since they were a little less in the 90s. How do we stop the process of all these people that in the past were dictators? And of course, they needed an enemy to convince their people to keep them in power. Today, they're actually elected people. That they need Netanyahu needs the Palestinians, Trump needs the immigrants, Putin needs the Ukrainians. It seems to be a process in which, to be in power, of course, you're either in power or in prison. See Trump, see Putin, see Netanyahu. So if you cannot be in power, you're in prison. And so one of the things that you want to do most is to diminish the United Nations and everybody who wants to make peace. Because if there is a peace, then you lose the enemy. And so, I don't know if there is an answer, but is there a way that are people voting because they really don't know what to do anymore and who to vote for, and they end up voting for the Mussolini, the Franco, the Hitler of the past, but they vote them today? I don't know. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for this inspiring conversation and also provoking thoughts. Just last Tuesday, we heard a long speech from our leaders talking about peace needs weapons. We need investment on weapons. So Professor Bartoli also mentioned several words of the methodology of Sant'Egidio. I want to ask the word deterrence, that this was the word pronounced several times last Tuesday, that we need weapons because it's an instrument of deterrence for other countries to attack, to make peace in this way. what is your thoughts in that sense and your experience. Thank you.
Ma c'era la signora? There is a lady? Where? No.
I don't know if you're just collecting questions for a whole bunch of answers, but so I find myself convinced and very drawn to what you have to say about boundaries. But I also, maybe it's that I'm too embedded in the American political conversation, I also hear people saying, you know, we need boundaries, we need borders. There's an English idiom, I don't know if there's an Italian equivalent, that good fences make good neighbors. And then I found myself thinking also about the observation that, you know, some things need to happen confidentially inside the house in order to give people space to change. So I'm wondering if maybe you could say something about what is the proper function of boundaries to help us grow in the capacity for friendship and for peace.
Ok. Diciamo che
I'd like to say that
oggi c'è una
today
cultura
there is a culture
che viene
that-
da chi comanda,
it clearly comes from those who are in power.
che è una cultura
It's a culture
che ci dice che
that tells us
la guerra è
war
inevitabile,
is inevitable.
che ci sono troppi nemici
Enemies everywhere.
e che dobbiamo
We
ridare
have
forza alle
to-
nostre nazioni.
We have to give strength to our nations.
E questa è una cultura
This is a culture
che non trova
doesn't
non trova un contrasto,
there is no one against this. There is no resistance to
perché
this.
tanti ideali, diciamo,
Many ideals,
del vivere insieme,
living together,
anche dell'umanesimo, sono ormai, diciamo,
Humanism,
si sono indeboliti.
they are weakened.
Per molte ragioni, io ne dico una.
Many reasons, I'm just mentioning one.
Abbiamo investito su una globalizzazione economica,
Globalization that was only economic in
ma non
nature,
spirituale.
but not in a spiritual one.
Ci siamo uniti
We-
nel commercio,
we-
abbiamo appunto
We
abbattuto
experienced
tante
unity
frontiere,
in commerce and trade and abandoned.
ma non ci siamo
but
uniti tra popoli.
We are not able to unite ourselves.
Non abbiamo
as
capito che avevamo bisogno
We
dell'altro.
didn't understand that we needed one another.
E questa mancanza, diciamo, di una globalizzazione spirituale,
This
ideale,
lack of
come vogliamo definirla,
globalization of the spirit
oggi ci fa sentire
makes us today
molto deboli di fronte ai
feeling
discorsi
weak
della forza.
and unable to respond to these speeches and strong
Per questo io
strength.
oggi dicevo, dobbiamo reagire con una cultura della
We
pace,
have to respond with a culture of peace.
altrimenti chi vuole la guerra vincerà sempre.
Otherwise, those who want war will always win.
E guardate che questo ha delle conseguenze terribili sui
This
più
has
giovani,
enormous consequences for the young people, the
sui
young
bambini,
generation, the children.
in questa educazione,
In this
diciamo,
education
allo
to-
scontro,
To the clash, to the
al pensare che
enmity,
l'altro è un nemico
to
che
think of
produrrà
others
solo
as
disastri nel
enemies, and
futuro.
that we can only expect disasters.
Quindi la mia è una visione parziale,
My
naturalmente,
vision obviously is partial,
però vedo
but I do see
come cresce oggi un giovane, con
how
quali
does
ideali.
a young person grow, now.
Quando io e Federico Rampini eravamo giovani,
When Federico Rampini and I were
crescevamo con l'ideale di
there was
un'Europa unita.
there was a strong sense of a united Europe.
Volevamo abbattere le frontiere.
It
Era
was
questo.
important to
Oggi un giovane
destroy
di oggi
boundaries, but today, if you are a young person today,
è
you
molto
have-
influenzato da
is
questa
very,
cultura.
very heavily influenced by this culture of
E chi
war.
non è
Those who
forte
are not
E chi non è forte oggi comincia a avere problemi molto seri, anche psichici,
and there are many psychological
di chiusura in se
problems,
stesso,
and
di indebolimento.
there is a weakening of
C'è una grande responsabilità
an enormous responsibility
verso i più giovani. Io penso ai bambini africani, penso a tanti
African children,
adolescenti,
the
ragazzi.
adolescents.
Più lento? Ok.
I am translating too quickly, and so sono io, è il mio problema, perché io sto traducendo come se io parlassi dentro al, but in reality it makes the translation difficult. I apologize.
Il tema della deterrenza, quindi credo che appunto nell'età della forza dobbiamo ritrovare una forza spirituale e morale.
In the age of force, we need to find a strength that is moral and spiritual.
Il mio discorso voleva essere anche questo, diciamo, un appello, un invito a ritrovare quegli ideali che soli possono ricostruire un mondo, diciamo, migliore domani.
My speech was an invitation, an urging to find these ideals that could make really a different
Però anche un metodo, perché Sant'Egidio ha mostrato che è possibile fare la pace, che la pace è possibile. Noi dobbiamo credere che la pace è possibile. Oggi crediamo che la pace è impossibile. Questo è il salto culturale che bisogna fare.
But it's also a method, you know. It's also important to make the shift from thinking that peace is impossible and that there is no way that you can do anything like that, to actually thinking that peace is possible. This is a major cultural shift that we need to encourage.
Noi lo facciamo ogni anno radunando uomini di cultura e religione nello spirito di Assisi, di Giovanni Paolo II.
We do it every year, gathering religious leaders from all religious traditions in the spirit of Assisi, this gathering that started with John Paul II.
Lo facciamo ogni giorno con gente che viene, appunto, vittime di guerra, che vengono a chiedere di fare la pace nel loro paese o nel loro villaggio o nella loro regione.
We do it every day with all those who come asking us to help them make peace in their country, but also in their village, and also in their actual situations where they are.
Però sono voci soffocate.
Unfortunately, these are voices that are suffocating, easy enough.
E quindi bisogna essere voce di chi non ha voce.
We must be the voice of those who do not have voice.
In maniera molto concreta, lavorando per la pace.
Very concretely working for peace.
E sul tema della deterrenza, un tema complicatissimo che ci portiamo avanti dalla guerra fredda.
Deterrence is a very complicated issue that it was clearly the legacy of the Cold War.
È chiaro che ci sono gli aspetti positivi e gli aspetti negativi.
There are clearly negative aspects and positive aspects to deterrence.
Non si può essere troppo deboli di fronte al forte, ma accumulare armi e comunque costruire una polveriera che può prendere fuoco da un momento all'altro.
It's not possible to be too weak in front of those who are strong and dangerous, but at the same time, to build arsenals that can explode, is also very problematic and dangerous.
Grazie per la vostra attenzione. Poi
a comment. I wanted to thank you very much during your speech when you were talking about having, when in dialogue with others that one doesn't agree with, that it's one has to have the humanity to allow that other voice to speak, because it's through that understanding and listening, and it's not necessarily a surrender, but if one doesn't listen, and if one doesn't allow or see the humanity of the other person, one cannot begin to then figure out the road to peace. And I really appreciate that you said that. And I feel like that's a call and a challenge to each and every one of us and in our daily lives to allow for that kind of freedom of dialogue and recognizing the humanity and the love that Christ gives through us, that we should be seeing in everyone, and no matter how we disagree with them. And so I want to thank you for that really powerful message.
Thank you. Thank you.